Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, NDC Now. This is a really hot topic these days, and we're glad that you could take the time to join us this afternoon. I'm Judy Howard with Agency Services, and I'm happy to have with me here today two really good folks in this industry and with ARC that are really involved in all the stuff pretty much with NDC, with IATA, with One Order, and all the efforts that are happening now and taking place that are going to lead the industry into the future. So I'd like to introduce Shelly Younger, who's been with ARC now for over 12 years, coming from American Airlines with a really extensive background in the travel industry and in the airline industry as well. She is one of our senior managers here with Industry Relations. And also I have Paige Blunt here as well, who came to us from American as well, and Shelly and Paige first met at American, so that's pretty exciting, and now they've been able to reconnect here at ARC. And Paige has been with us for over 2 years, and she and Shelly work together in our industry relations area, and they are really, this is their area of expertise, and this is what their work is all concentrated on now. So and the other thing is I'm going to take questions as we go along. So please type them in on the right-hand side in your control panel where it says questions. So any questions that you have during this presentation, please type them in, and Paige and Shelly will get to those, and we'll get most of those answered. The ones that we don't get to, we'll follow up with you either individually or with the Q&A document. Okay, without further ado then, Shelly, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Judy, and welcome everyone. And again, I want to echo Judy's comments. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. So let's go ahead and jump right in. We're going to talk about airline distribution. We're going to get a little NDC refresher course and compare GDS distribution models with NDC. And we're going to talk about, where do things stand today with both airlines, GDSs, and with ARC in terms of NDC, and then touch base on a few NDC discussion topics and wrap up. I do want to say that, yes, we're happy to take questions throughout the presentation, so please don't hesitate. I absolutely love questions. So, and if I can't answer it right here, we'll get back to you as soon as possible. So let's jump right in. NDC, new distribution capability. So again, what is it? And again, this focus of the presentation today is sort of a broad sweeping, where do things stand, what is NDC, and what is ARC doing. I'm not going to get down into a lot of nitty-gritty detail on NDC, but if you'd like to do that post-webinar, I'm happy to set something up. So what is NDC really? And you've probably heard this, but NDC is an XML standard, and it allows airlines to differentiate their airline product. It's one standard that can be used by multiple technology partners, and it improves speed to market. And it does that because essentially it's one standard that everyone can use, so that when partner A is talking to partner B, they're both talking the same language. That's really the key there. It supports personalized offers by allowing agents to provide customer details before the ticket is issued. So during the shopping experience, you can provide the customer information, and the airline, depending on how they've implemented NDC, can provide specialized offers. It also allows for the transmission of rich content, which is just kind of a fancy way of saying how to visualize product features. So some of the pop-up boxes and pictures that you see today on websites. That's a fancy name for rich content. So airline distribution in the agency channel, and this is typically, not 100%, but this is typically how things have been for a pretty long time. The airlines file their fares and schedules through third parties like ATPCO, CETA, and OAG. And those third parties then distribute all of those fares and schedules to the GDSs. When the agency goes into the GDS to search, the GDS has those fares and schedules and then communicates directly with the airline on availability. And it's really the key here, if you don't walk away with anything else, is that it's the GDS and the agency really that are building the offer inside the GDS from those filed fares and fare rules and schedules. So at a high level, that's how airline distribution works today. Now, what changes with NDC? Well, what really NDC was sort of striving to do was to allow the airline to take more control of their product. So what they would do is they will be the pricing engine. They have their own fares. It's not distributed through a third party. They're the ones creating the content. And the agency can get at that content 3 different ways, essentially. The agency, if you're really large and you decide you want to connect directly with the airline, you can set up a direct connection and trade XML, the NDC XML messages back and forth. And then, of course, you would display that content potentially along with traditional GDS content, maybe on your website. You can go through a third-party aggregator, and we'll get into the difference between an aggregator and a GDS here in a second. But you could go through an aggregator, and there are a number of those in the industry today. If you'd like some resources, we can send you those later. And that aggregator can help you create those NDC messages and communicate back and forth with the various airlines. Essentially, just like the name sounds, they aggregate all the messages so that you don't have to do a lot of the technology work. You can actually go through a GDS, and a GDS can be an aggregator. So it's a little confusing because the GDS can actually play 2 roles. They can be in the traditional way where both the agency and the GDS are creating the offer by the filed fares, or the GDS can communicate with the airline using these NDC XML messages and display the content. What I want you to walk away from with this model is that in the NDC model, the airline builds the offer. In the former model, the GDS and the agency built the offer. In the NDC model, the airline does. So I'll pause just briefly and see if we have any questions.
Not yet.
Okay,
Not yet.
Great. So where do things stand today in terms of airlines and NDC? Well, let me first, there's a couple of questions that I consistently ask that I want to sort of touch base on right away. The first one is, are airlines required to implement NDC? And that answer is no, they are not. Whether or not an airline will utilize NDC, which is a tool in their toolbox on how to distribute their content, will depend on the airline's distribution strategy. It is possible that an airline may not choose to implement NDC at all. They may be using another type of messaging to communicate with an agency or with an aggregator. So again, I go back to, and I kind of say this over and over, but it's important. NDC is just the message type. Second, will all airlines implement NDC? Probably not. I can't give you a guaranteed answer, but if you look back in history and you look at, let's say, the implementation of e-tickets. Well, e-tickets came out and a number of airlines, started jumping on board. They saw the benefits. But when you really looked at the reality of how long it took for the industry to really convert fully to ET, it was, over a dozen years, if not more. So, this is not something that's going to happen overnight, nor will all airlines choose to do this.
Yes, see, Michelle, we do have a couple questions. First question, is the content the same regardless of whether an agency uses a GDS or NDC?
That is a fantastic question. And the answer to that is it depends on the airline. The airline may actually choose to distribute all of its content both through the GDS, meaning the traditional way, filed fares, created content, and through NDC. Or you'll see in just a second, I have a couple of snapshots that show there are some airlines that are putting putting content through NDC that is not available through the GDS. So it really, again, does depend on the airline strategy. I hope that answered the question.
Great. And then one other, just clarification, in today's GDS model, isn't it that the GDS that builds the offer based on the filed fares that it has, not the agency building the offer?
Well, in theory, yes. The reason I said it like that is based on the agency commands. They can override what the GDS provides as the offer and actually kind of create their own offer sometimes. And sometimes that's based on contracts that they have, right? So the GDS may actually create the offer, but the airline, or excuse me, the agency will then, based on a contract, go in and override and maybe apply a discount or apply something else. So that's why I, use the term both agency and GDS. It's a great question, though. Okay. So last, will airlines implement NDC in the same way? And let's go to the next slide for that. The short answer on that is no, they will not. And I want to give just some examples of what we're seeing in the industry. And just as for illustrative purposes, I think it's important to know that not every airline is going to implement, and they're not going to implement in the same way. So an example is there's Airline A out there, and they're really focused on implementing NDC with ancillaries first. So that is the key, with the possibility of phasing in NDC for tickets. So maybe shopping and booking, but sometime in the future. They don't know when that is. Their initial drive is to get their ancillary content out in the marketplace through the agency channel. Airline B may say, well, I'm going to focus on implementing NDC for shopping and booking only, and maybe even for specific agency types. So let's say they want to start first with large OTAs or any OTA, or the leisure market, or the corporate market, or the consolidator market, or maybe all of them. Again, it does depend on the agency, the airline strategy. And in this case, shopping and booking, so the airline is controlling the content, they're giving the price, or what you'll hear in the world today called an offer. And then they'll pass it off. They may actually issue the ticket themselves, or they might pass it off to someone else to issue the ticket. So they're concentrated on shopping and booking through NDC. Airline C might say, you know what, I want to implement NDC for really across the board. So I'm going to do shopping, booking, payment, and ticketing for multiple agency types and in multiple markets. And then Airline D, they may say, well, you know what, I want to focus NDC on shopping and booking and payment, but I want to do it first through a meta search engine. And then I may roll it out to multiple agency markets. And I have seen that in multiple cases where they'll pick a meta search engine, so like Hipmunk or Travel Fusion, and they will communicate back and forth with them using the NDC messages, but that's really their first step. So again, this is really to point out that airlines can do this in many different ways. So a couple of things here is, it's kind of like, where do things stand today? There are 58 airlines that have registered to be IATA NDC certified at their various levels. So I'm going to pause just a second and say, well, what does IATA NDC certification really mean, and what is this about all the levels? Well, IATA is certifying. They actually certify airlines, aggregators, GDSs, sellers, which would be travel agencies, and other IT people in the mix. And they say, does your message follow the current schema that we have out there? Does it meet, do all the fields have, are kind of formatted the same? Is it in the right structure? That's really all the certification is, which is great, right? Because you want to be able, you want to know that your partner is meeting the guidelines that are out there. So it's definitely, a lot of people are getting this certification. And levels 1, 2, or 3, level 1 just means you're You've sent in XML messages for ancillaries, so post-booking. Level 2 is much more around the offer, so around shopping. And level 3 is really sort of everything. I'm sending IATA messages on shopping, booking, ticketing, payments, and they're going to certify that my messages meet a specific schema. Now, airlines do not have to be IATA certified to implement NDC. They can use the schema and say, you know, I don't necessarily need the certification right now. I may want to get it later. And a lot of people do that for testing purposes. So like a pilot or testing, they'll be using the NDC schema, but they don't necessarily get a certification right away. And the same holds true for aggregators and others. And if you go out there and search, and I recommend going to either the Airlines website or really Googling. Airlines are really at a number of different phases and strategies with NDC. You can't really put them all into 1, 2, or even 3 buckets. There are literally, dozens of buckets out there that people are following. And one last point is we're focused here today on NDC, which is XML messages, but airlines have been doing direct connections for a really long time. So I don't want folks to forget that airlines can actually connect directly with the agency community and control their content through other types of messaging. It's been around for a long, long time. The good thing about sort of the IATA NDC schema is that it was created with a number of industry participants, and everyone has essentially agreed, hey, this is what we're going to go by.
Actually, I've got one question.
Sure.
For a travel agency that earns overrides today, will they still be able to earn overrides with NDC?
So, you guys are probably going to get really tired of hearing me say this, but that does depend on your airline partner and how they implement NDC. And let me give you an example of what I mean by that. So we've been talking with a number of carriers, but a couple of them are evaluating how they're going to apply upfront commissions, overrides, contracts in the NDC world. And again, people are at various phases. Some folks are further along in like creating a commission database where they're loading their contracts and they feel like they can apply upfront commission right away. Others maybe aren't far as long, and they may work with their agency partner to do something a bit different and say, hey, if we implement NDC right away, maybe I pay you on the back end. Again, I can't promise anything, but what I can say is that it's definitely being looked at, and folks are in various stages of being able to apply that. But they do understand that it is critical to meet those needs. Okay, good. I took a few screenshots because most of you probably heard the 3 airlines that I've got up here. Again, there are 58 airlines that are certified, and I know a lot more than that are in various stages of evaluating or doing pilots or testing with NDC. But these 3 screenshots were meant to really show you that there really are different strategies. So not only does the airline make a decision on whether or not they want to do NDC, they make a decision on what types of markets and which agencies. They make a decision on what types of NDC messages they may want to start out with. But then they also have to make a decision on how they either want to incentivize or create the opportunity for the agency to want to go to NDC. And that's done in a couple of different ways. Folks like British Airways and Lufthansa, they're using kind of what we affectionately refer to as the stick method. So they're applying a fee if the agency goes through the GDS to issue a ticket, and that's happening today. But they offer the opportunity that if you either talk with them about NDC or look to sign up with them about NDC, that fee is waived when you go through the NDC tool. So that's just a couple of examples. And then on the flip side, somebody like American has said, I'm going to take the carrot approach. And if you come and talk to me and set up, issuing tickets through NDC, and it doesn't have to be everything. You can start out small, medium, large. You really have to have a conversation with the airline. But American has said, hey, I'm going to pay you basically an upfront, fee to use NDC, so like a commission. And that's really revolutionary because British Airways and Lufthansa came out and they were charging a fee if you went through the GDS and could avoid that fee by using NDC, whereas American actually said, well, I'll pay you to come to NDC. So again, just illustrating that there are different ways to go about this.
Shelly, another question come in. Does NDC allow an airline to sell code share to customers?
So the short answer is yes, it does. And there is an interline schema, and it does allow for code share. That in sitting in on a number of those meetings and continuing to do that, that was really the hardest part, and still is the hardest part for interline. Most folks aren't there yet, and it's probably going to be a little while before they go there. So they're starting out, with their own fares. But look for that to happen because obviously you can't progress in the industry with all of the different partnerships and alliances, et cetera, JVs, without that. So it is coming. But right now, most are focused on their own fares.
And going back to this page that's up currently, will the BA, Lufthansa, Air France, KLM fees likely go away when the GDSs become level 3 certified?
So let's look at that. So if the GDS signs up and British Airways and Lufthansa and whoever else talk with the GDS and say, okay, we're going to distribute the NDC, we're going to distribute our fares through you as an aggregator, again, not the traditional model, then most likely the answer is yes. British Airways and Lufthansa and those folks want you to come to them through that NDC mechanism and through that mechanism so that they control the offer. They don't really care how that's done necessarily in all cases. There are some cases where they do, but they don't care if you go use a GDS as an aggregator or come to them directly. Now, some of them are starting off saying, hey, come to me directly while they work out some additional technology stuff with the GDSs. But you can avoid that fee, but it has to be an NDC connection. If you still log into the GDS and they're filed fares and you're doing it like you're traditionally doing it, there will still be a fee for that. And each airline, of course, sets that at their own discretion. Okay, GDSs, AKA aggregators. Well, let's stop here. So I talked about the difference between GDSs and aggregators. Hopefully everyone knows what a GDS is today. An aggregator is kind of a fancy name for someone who plays a similar GDS role in the NDC world. That could be a technology partner that has decided to kind of jump in the mix and sit in between the travel agencies and the airlines and aggregate those messages for the agency community. And in most cases, it's going to be the GDS. So the GDS is going to play a dual role. They're going to play the role in the traditional way, and they can play a role as being an aggregator. Now, the great part is that, if you're using a GDS or really any type of aggregator, they're going to be able to take in content from every direction and display it to you. That's their end game, right? Because to you, it should be seamless. And that, I know, is what they're working on. Those are discussions that we have with the GDSs. So I hope that answers the question.
Yes.
Okay, so let's talk about Amadeus first. So where do things stand with Amadeus? So I don't want to confuse things here. There are different types of, you can be certified in different ways. I think I mentioned you could be certified as an airline, as an aggregator, as an IT provider, or as a seller. I'm focused here on the GDSs as the aggregator role. IT provider, in a very short form, is an entity that provides services and tools to help support NDC. But I'm not going to kind of get into detail on that. I don't want to get us distracted. So what that really means is Amadeus could actually be certified as an aggregator in one level, and they can play a role over here as an IT provider, maybe to the airline or to someone else, and have a different certification. So if you look at this and say, hey, wait a minute, I read that GDS was this level certified, make sure you look, because whether or not it's the aggregator role or the IT provider. So Amadeus is currently level 1 certified for aggregator, and level 1 again is the ability to send messages back and forth for ancillaries, post-booking ancillaries, and they are on track to be level 3 certified by the end of this year. And as you can see, just going out and really just Google Amadeus and NDC, and you can see they're really in different phases depending on the markets and who they're dealing with, but they're moving forward very strong with NDC. They want to be the entity, they want to continue to be the entity that the agency comes to play both the traditional role and the role to send NDC messages. Sabre right now, they are level 1 certified as an aggregator, again, being able to send messages on ancillaries, and this is the one that you may be confused about because you'll hear they're level 3 on the IT provider side. But again, I'm focused today just on the aggregator. And once again, what I found was kind of interesting, if you kind of look back, and maybe I'm a bit of a nerd on this, but Sabre historically, when we first started out, was pretty quiet on NDC for a number of years. But as sort of the tide turned, they realized that this was going to be sort of the future of the industry, and they did not, the GDS don't want to be left behind. They really jumped in the mix. And so, and I know they're also looking to be level 3 certified as an aggregator. I don't have a timeline on that quite yet. And then Travelport is the only one right now that's level 3 certified as an aggregator. And again, that's the ability to do ancillaries, shopping, booking, ticketing, payments. So they can really do everything from end to end. Yes.
Couple questions coming through. First of all, a ticket that's issued through NDC, is it still going to come through ARC to settle?
Oh, can I put that on pause, because we're getting ready to go right there here in just a second. I promise to answer that.
Okay, next, what are the GDSs likely to provide that is different from what they provide today once they are level 3 certified?
What is different than they provide today? Okay, so today, they are providing the role of taking in fares, schedules, and availability and creating that offer for the agency, a variety of offers, of course. And they do a number of other things. They send messages to the agency's back office. They help the agency reconcile. There are a host of things. You guys can probably tell me way more than I can tell you on what the GDS does for you today. Tomorrow, in an aggregator role as well, they can actually take the content from the airline via NDC and take the content that is traditionally filed through ATPCO and display that for you. So really, they're taking content from multiple directions and making it really easy for you to be able to do NDC or not NDC, and then, of course, possibly play some of those additional roles, creating messages to feed to your mid and back offices. And so some of the roles will be the same, some may not. I think that's really going to depend on the agency and your needs. So I highly, highly recommend you reach out and talk to them. One thing that I do want to say is that we're in the midst of talking with the GDSs about, and I'd be curious to see your feedback on getting them to come and maybe do a webinar on where they are with NDC and answer maybe some of these more detailed questions.
Is NDC only for airlines, or will car and hotels participate at some time? I think there's a little combination of ideas there.
Yeah, no, there is a combination of ideas. At this moment, the NDC kind of model, the NDC schema, is primarily for airlines to distribute their content to a variety of parties, traditionally third parties, the travel agencies, through whatever mechanisms that we've been talking about today. There's been discussion on bringing in hotels and cars and tours, but it's not, we're not really anywhere significant with that. Ultimately, for those of you that have heard of one order, that will potentially be rolled into one order. So NDC is kind of the setup for one order. Again, NDC allows the airline to price and control their content. One order in a very short form is the ability to kind of get rid of all of our old ways, don't rely on the ticket number, don't rely necessarily on an e-ticket database, and everything is in sort of one place. So you really just add an order kind of like you do with Amazon. You add a ticket, you add a seat assignment, you add this, you add that, and if for those that use Amazon, you really have an order and it has multiple things inside of it. And so at that point, I know there's a lot of interest in bringing in the other industries, but that's still a bit to come.
Okay, let's keep going.
All right, okay.
A few more in a minute.
So ARC and NDC, where do things stand today? Well, I'm excited to announce that in February, we actually did a phase 1 last year, and in February of this year, we implemented enhancements to our current settlement product to support a wide variety of NDC implementations. So what does that really mean? Well, we call it Release 1, and what it does is it allows the airline to utilize their own ticket stock or our neutral ticket stock. So we give form codes, so that number that ends up being your e-ticket number or your EMD number to the GDSs, and they sign it to you when you issue transactions. Well, the airline has their own form code ranges. And so we can take in either one of those. We can process multiple file formats. Today, we get a specific type of file format from the GDSs. And in the IATA world, they have a different format. And we have limited capability, but we can actually take in that IATA format, which is called the RET. Our US format is called the SPERF. So we've expanded that capability. We are integrated, for those of you that are familiar with IATA's NDC link or web link. So if an airline wants to send transactions, all of their transactions to IATA, and IATA kind of partitions them out and sends them to the BSPs, well, they can send transactions to us. Let me throw a caveat in there, though, that those are transactions issued by U.S. agencies. So we are not expanding our role to take in transactions issued from other countries. IATA is really just a conduit for the airline to send us transactions. The airline has several credit card billing options. Today, primarily ARC initiates the credit billing. So when you issue a ticket and put in a credit card number, we actually take the information sent to us and we initiate the credit card billing file on behalf of the airline. And so the airline can choose to do that themselves for NDC, or we can do it. There are going to be some business rule changes. And what that means is that depending on how NDC is implemented, if you think about it, if the airline has controlled the offer, so you've done your shopping, they've given you an offer, you've accepted that offer, then that ticket is then issued and it stands. There typically is not going to be any way to override that fare or taxes or anything. The good news with that is that means no more debit memos. So if the airline is pricing the transaction and there happens to be something wrong with that pricing or the taxes or the fees, you will not be getting a debit memo for that if the airline has done the pricing. And so in order to obviously help prevent any changes from happening, some airlines have asked us to prevent any sort of changes that you may do today for regular GDS transactions. Now, again, that does not impact regular GDS transactions that are coming in today. Everything stays the same today. It's just for NDC transactions, again, depending on what the airline needs and wants, we may actually just put some parameters, limitation parameters around changes in IAR. For the agency, we'll actually put an NDC identifier in IAR, so you'll be able to tell NDC transactions from non-NDC. And we'll output both NDC and non-NDC in the BOS file. And we'll, of course, output NDC and non-NDC on our, what we affectionately call our carrier accounting tape. It's not a tape, it's an electronic file. But we'll include, that's the airline revenue accounting file. We'll include both in there. I think one thing I'm going to stop and really concentrate on here is a lot of people, when I talk about this release and I talk about some of the changes that are being made, they say, oh my goodness, is that just going to be turned on and I won't know anything about it? Absolutely not. You and the airline have to enter into an agreement to kind of trade NDC messages, whether or not that's directly or through an aggregator or GDS. That is agreement that you're entering into, so you'll know what the parameters are around those transactions settling through ARC. So a lot of people get a little worried because they're like, oh, is it just going to happen, you know, kind of randomly? And no, it is not. There's going to be an agreement between you and the airline.
Couple of questions. Thank you for addressing that earlier question, Shelly. One of the things that they were asking for is GDS traditionally were charging for sectors, and now are they going to be looking to agents to pay a fee to connect them or something? I don't think we can really answer that at the moment because I think it's going to be very subjective.
I think it is going to be very subjective, and I definitely don't want to lead anyone astray. So that is definitely a discussion point that you want to have with your GDS and what that pricing looks like and who's going to pay what.
Okay, next one. If a reservation is booked via NDC, how will changes and issues be supported? There are multiple, I think, ideas on that front as well.
There are multiple ideas. So again, not to scare anyone, but sometimes, you know, when you're rolling out something new, like NDC, you typically do it in phases. This is a pretty monumental change in how business is done. So for instance, there are the airlines that are progressing a little faster, like British Airways and Lufthansa. They are focusing on ticket issuance first, so the sale of the ticket, and they are currently working on being able to do post-sale NDC messages, which means refunds, exchanges, other changes. To start out with, some of those airlines are looking for, at least temporarily, for the agency may have to go back to them or go to their website to do post-ticket changes. And that's why it's important, you know, that's why airlines are doing sort of a phased approach, because they're going to work with a partner where they work through some of those issues. Who knows, they may create a dedicated resource for them to call. They don't want to impact the customer experience negatively, but oftentimes you just can't turn on the whole spigot at once. So it is going to depend on the airline. Long term, I know all the airlines that are looking to go, you know, all of the different levels of NDC, the shopping, booking, ticketing, payment, they will eventually, all of them want to do post-sale transactions. That's obviously, it's absolutely critical for our community.
Okay, thank you. Are there any back office reconciling tools available with NDC? Do we know anything about that part of the thing yet?
So it's interesting. I've been in a couple of different meetings, and the airlines and other technology partners and GDSs are absolutely already looking at that. I don't have anything specific right now, but I know that it's especially important for those GDSs because that's additional added value that they can do. And of course, the transactions coming through us, you'll get also a back office file to be able to reconcile from ARC.
Right. Will GDS likely be able to help me comparison shop in the new environment where the airline establishes an offer?
Oh, absolutely. Of course, that's one of the benefits of using a GDS, right, is that when you do your search request, in theory, if all goes well, you won't really necessarily know or care whether or not an offer is NDC or not NDC. The GDS is gonna show you everything that meets your search parameters. So you're gonna be able to shop across different airlines and different types of offers. So that's definitely one of the benefits of using an aggregator.
And one thing you talked about, the debit memo possibilities would go away if the airline was actually ticketing for that. What about those credit card chargebacks? And do those differ if the airline or ARC initiates the credit card billing?
That's a great question. I actually have a slide on it here in just a second. So again, hold that thought.
Okay, terrific. And one of the other things about this, the new NDC release that ARC has done, now they have to wait for a load from the airlines to IAR to see the transactions with NDC. Would that be able to happen more quickly?
So again, I'm going to sound a bit like a broken record. It depends on kind of what phase and how the airline has implemented. In theory, yes, if the GDS is sort of working as the aggregator for you, when those XML messages are being traded back and forth, they're obviously working on tools to actually pick up pieces of that data and hand it over to you, so you'll see something right away. That's going to be, I can't imagine an agency living life without that. Right. So the GDSs are working on that. Now, in terms of our settlement process, for the moment, and we're going to get into that, we kind of are still living in a bit of a legacy world, so we process things in batch. That is changing. I do not have a time frame, but ultimately down the line, we'd love to be able to take in, do like an extract from those messages and load it into IAR real time. So somewhere down the line, we definitely want to do that. But for the time being, it'll be still a batch process on a daily basis. Okay, so I'm just going to go over this real quick because I want to get to some of the additional details. I've talked a lot about this already. So the point of this first part is that we can take in the transaction from any source. So whether or not it's a direct connection with the agency through an aggregator, if the airline wants to send us a file through NDC Link, or we've got all the traditional ways we get in files. That's all going to come to us. They can come to us, and we will process them depending on what type of transaction it is and the parameters set by the airlines if it's an NDC transaction. And we may initiate credit card billing on NDC or not. We will still do our traditional way of initiating credit billing for those transactions. We will load all the transactions we receive into IAR and our enterprise data warehouse, and the agency will get a BOSS file. And then, of course, we'll output the carrier accounting tape, the revenue accounting sales file to the airlines, and it'll contain NDC and non-NDC. And then, of course, one of the benefits of sort of keeping ARC in the middle, there are multiples we'll get to, but one is that the airline can still accept cash sales for NDC, because if it did not come through ARC, there would have to be a way for the airline and the agency to meet in the middle and figure out how they were going to transmit cash. So next up is, okay, so what should my agency do next? Well, it really it does depend. So several factors are really going to drive how you approach NDC. So the agency size and model. So if you tend to be on the smaller side of things, you may rely on your GDS to be your aggregator, and you may never have to actually do much at all. The GDS may play that role, and that will be maybe part of a future contract that you talk with them about. If you're a larger agency or you're kind of a mega OTA, most likely you might already be in discussions with your key airline partners and GDS partners around sort of who's doing what. So it does depend on kind of how big you are, kind of what model you have. also, your technology resources and budget. It just may not be something that you want to pursue, and so again, you're going to be reliant maybe on your GDS to do that. And then some airlines are really market focused on where they're doing NDC. They may target necessarily, intra-Europe travel or, Europe to South America, whatever is meaningful to them. So it kind of depends on what market you're focused on. We really encourage you, if you have an interest in understanding more, is if you have some key airline partners, and reach out to your GDSs to find out details around their roadmap. And we would be happy to facilitate those conversations if you have an interest. So definitely let me know. There are seriously a bajillion resources out there. ARC, we've done a number of webinars. We're on panels, presentations. In fact, our CEO was just talking about NDC on another webinar. We have every year our Travel Connect. We have sessions on distribution in NDC. We have LinkedIn posts. And we're relaunching our dedicated NDC website soon. So please wait to hear more about that. There'll be a lot of resources out there for you there. The GDSs also do many of the same things. I encourage you to go to their websites, and they do have a lot of information. And of course, IATA has a number of different resources available. They have a dedicated website, documents, training sessions, and we're happy to include some of those links in the deck post-webinar. This is our sort of ARC's original website. Like I said, we will be relaunching. So again, be on the lookout for that. We're going to have some really good information out there for you, and be on the lookout. We're going to be still doing additional webinars and posts. And if you have any recommendations or you don't feel like you're getting the information that you want or need, let us know. We'd be happy to consider doing, something specialized maybe. And these are just, we don't have to go through every one of them, but these are just, I thought put together. I get asked a lot, well, what do I talk to? What do I say? What are some questions I need to think about when I talk to my airline or GDS partners? So some of the topics are, what's the airline strategy and timeline to implement NDC? What types of messages? Do they support post-sale servicing, just like we were talking about? What types of fares will be available? What payment types are supported, credit, debit, local payment types, or cash? And then the infamous question that was asked is, how will credit card chargebacks be managed? Again, most likely what's going to happen, especially with shopping and booking, the airline may or may not go out and get the credit card authorization. If they do shopping, booking, payment, and ticketing, they're typically going to be the ones to go get the authorization, and they may in fact run that transaction through their fraud scoring tools. Maybe. It is not a guarantee. That's a discussion point you would want to have. And then the final discussion point is, okay, what does happen when a chargeback takes place? It really does depend. I've heard airlines that may be using that as a negotiating tool. Might be something you definitely want to bring up when you're having those conversations. So to kind of go back to that question, it does depend on the airline. And then again, upfront commissions and any contracts. Will those be applicable right now or in the future, and how will those be applied? Then for GDS and aggregators, again, this is not meant to be an exhaustive list, but contact them, go to a webinar. What's their GDS strategy and the timeline to implement? Will they display both NDC and non-NDC fares in a seamless tool? And how will that implementation impact your agency's business, like back and mid-office? Will you get a back and mid-office file for NDC transactions as well as non-NDC? And will they still provide other types of integrated reporting tools, processing tools? How will this impact your invoicing? There are a number of different items to consider. And some of those are listed here. I really do highly recommend, even if you don't necessarily have an interest right away, is just do a little bit of research on NDC and what it really means. It really can be done, a quick search can be done in a matter of 10 or 15 minutes to get really a high level. And again, happy to provide some resources to you. Reach out to your partners and initiate discussions. This is kind of where I say sort of drive your strategy. You drive the conversation. So get out there and get in front of it if you feel like it's going to be important, and maybe not wait until it comes to you. And then ask a lot of questions around how the airline is going to implement NDC. How will it impact your ticketing process on your website? What about corporate booking tools? Concur is right in the middle of NDC. They're taking in some NDC messages, so you may, for those of you that integrate with Concur, you may want to have some conversations with them. Will there be any performance agreement or commission changes with NDC? Again, how will it impact your customer invoicing or servicing? How will it be integrated into corporate booking? And duty of care is a big topic of conversation, because historically, the companies that help support duty of care get their data from the GDSs. So if you decide to do a direct connection with the airline instead of going through a GDS as an aggregator, it's important to understand how duty of care is going to be managed.
Okay, a couple of questions come in about voiding. Will you be able to void in using NDC?
So yes. Again, some of it kind of depends. If you're maybe you're only doing shopping, at which point you don't need to send, once you issue the ticket and it's issued not through NDC, you'll have the traditional voiding process. If the airline is doing shopping, booking, ticketing, the whole 9 yards, it will be up to them on whether or not they can do voids right away. Obviously, that's definitely a question you want to ask, and if not, how does it go about? But most of the airlines that I'm talking to, there is some capability to do voiding, because obviously if you issue a ticket, here in the U.S., you typically have 24 hours to change your mind. So those that I've been talking to have that capability.
If the ticket's booked through NDC, who owns that ticket? The agency or the airline? There's a good one.
Oh my goodness gracious. I actually can't answer that question, because to be honest with you, in today's world, through the GDS, you will get 6 people that say they own pieces of that transaction. And that may change a bit with NDC, because if the airline is controlling the offer and they're issuing the ticket, most likely they may decide to say, hey, I own more of that data than I did before. But unfortunately, that's not something I can address. That is definitely above my pay grade.
Let's see. Low-cost carriers, are they in with NDC or?
So I know there's definitely been some evaluation. If you think about it carefully, the low-cost carriers were NDC before NDC was cool, because low-cost carriers have controlled their content for the most part since day one. So when you think about issuing a ticket on Spirit or Allegiant or Southwest, if there are some that have direct connections to them. And that direct connection is really what this is about. Again, it doesn't matter whether you direct connect using a specialized schema like the low-cost carriers have, or you use NDC, but essentially, yes, they're already doing it. Now, whether or not they decide to eventually convert to using the specific NDC schema, that I don't know. Most of them are probably going to argue, hey, I'm kind of already doing it.
Anything that you can say about kind of the benefit of using NDC instead of a GDS? Anything that kind of what would you say was the benefit?
Well, I want to be careful, because it's not an or. It's not a either or. You can do both. It most likely, again, most agencies are probably going to look to their GDS to display both NDC and non-NDC content. you know, let's be frank. There might be some cases where an airline says you have to use NDC content for certain things. I would say that, you know, the benefits are some that I've laid out here. In some cases, you may get access to content that you can't get access to through the GDS. You may be able to avoid a fee. You may be able to earn a commission. Most of the time, you'll be able to avoid debit memos. So that's a big key. And I would say the really one of the things that I haven't talked a whole lot about that's important is eventually specialized offers through NDC, because this will allow airlines eventually, and some can even do it in a mild form now, but to create kind of on the fly dynamic pricing. And so that will be interesting because you won't be able to do that through the GDS.
You did mention earlier that with our new thing that there's going to be an NDC identifier and IAR somewhere.
Yes.
Probably not right here, but we will include that in the responses about where that will be seen in IAR, or
so
do you know that yet?
We have that. Yes, we do. The only reason I hesitate is you're not going to see it unless you're doing NDC transactions.
Okay.
So we can send out a test screenshot, but I don't want to confuse things, because again, if you're not doing NDC right now with an airline, you're not going to see that identifier. Eventually, as airlines kind of start sending us more transactions, or sending us transactions, I should say, our test partner, we can announce, was British Airways. They haven't implemented yet, but we expect them to this year and are in conversations. So once those start coming more on board, we'll probably expect to have more webinars where we go through this in a lot more detail. But if somebody does if they really have a desire to see it, I'm happy to send it out. I just would prefer not to send it out to the whole group. It just gets confusing.
Okay. And another question came across again about the void. Really, it's talking more to the whole, you know, if the ticket goes into, they issue it Friday, then they usually have till Monday. I mean, I think that's still, you know, on the table based on the carrier that you're doing NDC transactions with. I don't think that changes.
Well, it does depend on the airline. Most airline websites these days, if you go on, they only give you 24 hours.
Right.
So in some cases today, the agency gets longer than the airline website. Mm-hmm. Again, this is what I hear. I can't confirm anything. I would think that most airlines are going to probably follow what their website does. That's a discussion point I would have with the airline.
Yes, agree. Okay.
Okay, great. Thanks, Shelly and Paige. I think we have just a couple minutes left, so possibly one or two more questions before we wrap it up for this afternoon. Paige, I'll let you continue.
Okay, let's find one more. Let's see.
While you're doing that, Judy, if those questions that we just didn't get a chance to get to, how will they get out that information?
Yeah, great, Shelly. Thanks for bringing that up. And
okay.
I was gonna.
That's
okay. I was gonna address it at the wrap. But what we'll do, I think, I did send a message out to all of you that are on the call this afternoon, that once the webinar is over, that we will send out the presentation. We'll also send out a recorded version of this session. And I'm going to work with Paige and Shelly to probably do a little bit of a Q&A for some of the questions that we didn't get answered. And we'll send that out as well. And that Q&A will get posted on our website. The recorded session will also get posted on our website. And on the agency side, we post a lot of our stuff, like these resources, which if you haven't checked it out, it's under if you go to our top navigation at arccorp.com, it would be under support and training. Go there, and there's our Self-Paced Knowledge Center. If you go there to the resource area, we have a lot of information posted on there from other Q&A from webinars, from GDS Q&As from some of our webinars. Paige just did a wonderful debit memo best practices. So the NDC stuff will be there as well. So again, I just want to really give a round of applause to Shelly and for Paige for joining us this afternoon. This is a really real hot topic these days. I hope that this was informative and helpful. As always, if you have any questions, you can always reach me at jhoward@arcorp.com. If you need the presentation right away, I will work to get that to you. And you can always call our customer care with any questions regarding anything ARC, as you all know, at 855-816-8003, or email us at ccchealth@arcorp.com. Again, looking forward to having you on our next webinar. We have Sabre joining us on May 2nd, so kind of mark your calendars. You'll be seeing information in the TAC, and you'll also be getting invitations for that one. Again, thank you all for your very valuable time this afternoon and joining us on this really, really helpful and informative webinar. Thanks again, everyone.